I hope you had a great lunch. I'm super excited to be here again because this is my second time at Infobip. Oh, the lights is, yeah. I'm Gift Egwuenu, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about how you can build serverless applications on Cloudflare pages. That's me. I'm currently working Cloudflare's orange color. I work as a developer advocate at Cloudflare. I'm also a very big um, proponent of sharing knowledge. So I make like web development resources for developers and in different mediums. So on YouTube, on my blog, and several other platforms as well. Before I get started with this talk, I would like to see a show of hands. Does anybody know Cloudflare pages, or have you used Cloudflare pages? If you have, okay, that's a good number, I would say, because usually I would expect like a few hands or more hands, depending on the audience. And yeah, so today I'm going to go through what serverless is and lead up to how you can actually build serverless applications with Cloudflare pages. So yeah, my agenda for this talk includes introducing you to serverless and edge functions. I would assume that some people here are already familiar with the term, but I always like to start this talk with this just so people are familiar and also going to Cloudflare's network, right? So if you are already like a user of Cloudflare, you think Cloudflare is like just for security or deploying your website or DNS services, but we actually have way more offerings for developers, especially developers that are looking to build on the cloud, and then walk you through Cloudflare's developer ecosystem, some of the services that we offer you, how you can actually use them to build web applications. Yeah, the big part of my talk, or the thing you would take out from this talk, is how to actually use Cloudflare pages with functions. And I'll share a bit more on that as we go on. And of course, share resources for you to check out if you're interested in learning more. Yeah, so let's get started with serverless. The idea about serverless is that, of course, when people hear serverless, you're like, well, yeah, it's still servers, right? You're still going to be deploying your applications to servers. But the important bit that I like to share always is that you don't have to manage it yourself. The big idea here is that we've moved from traditional web servers where you have to provision it yourself, manage it. If there is downtime, you have to also, the implication, of course, is larger because higher cost, security, and all of that. And we've moved to, or we are currently still moving to the serverless architecture where you don't have to provision the servers. You pay like service providers like Cloudflare, for example, to help you host your platform. And we understand serverless is obviously you deploying your applications to the cloud without you managing that. But what about the term, the edge, right? Anybody here familiar with the edge? Just no, not the Edge browser, the Edge network, or yeah, great. Okay, I'll explain what the Edge is, and if you probably are not familiar with the Edge, I like to think. I'd like you to think about the Edge as still serverless applications deployed, but the big difference here with the Edge is it's deployed closest to the users. Take a look at this graph. This is the graph of the world. And each dark blue nodes you see there is actually a point of presence, or in this case, a CDN located in like different areas, Africa, South Africa, the US, and all of that, right? So the essence of, if you're moving away from serverless, you know that for every time you need to provision a serverless function, you get asked, where do you want this deployed? US East, US West, Europe, or all of that. Moving away from that to the edge is essentially servers deployed across the globe, right? So you have like a function duplicated across every region. So you have like unlimited region. And the big benefit of this coming from serverless is that it improves, it makes users access your application quickly without latency. One thing that I found from explaining why you should even move away from serverless to edge functions to people is the big benefit they get out of like faster connections for their users. So take, for instance, you have an application deployed in the US, right? And you have users in Europe or Africa or Asia. When you try to access this function or this application, of course, they will experience some form of latency. This is because the time it takes for the request to route back to the US, come back to them, you would experience like some friction. And also thinking about internet connectivity for some people, for example, in some areas, there's like limited bandwidth compared to some areas. Like I know that in the US, there's like 5G everywhere. Some places in Africa, they're still like using 3G, 4G. So you'd see if you have your users in locations like that, they would of course experience some slow connectivity. So yeah, the edge is essentially server geographically located closer to your users, to your end users. And I also like to think about it as it's still serverless functions because one, you don't get to manage the servers yourself. Two, it's duplicated everywhere, so you get the benefit of reduced latency, and it's cheaper. And I'll explain why that is. Moving on to Cloudflare's global network, if you're already familiar with Cloudflare, you find that people would generally think of it as the company where you provision like your DNS, or like they offer you zero trust services. But we also have like a big developer platform, right? We'll talk about that in a minute, but these are some stats from Cloudflare's network. We have over 270 points of presence, or CDNs, located across the world. We also have over 25 million internet properties. The essence is we are global, right? And if you're thinking of using Cloudflare, you find that you get the benefits of over 270 points of presence where you can deploy your applications to. And also, the developer ecosystem is growing. Like, I recently joined Cloudflare this year, but before then, I knew about workers. But now we even have Cloudflare pages, Cloudflare functions. So every year there's innovation going on the platform, right? And these are some of the developer ecosystem tools that we offer you to help you deploy and build your applications on the cloud. The first two I'll talk mostly about today is Workers KV and Cloudflare pages, but I'll breeze through some of these in case you're interested in checking out what they are. So the three big buckets here is compute, data storage, and developer services. We have Cloudflare Workers that allows you deploy your applications to the edge. This is essentially our serverless offerings, right? The big thing you need to know about Cloudflare Workers is it's on the edge, right? So I initially explained why, what the difference between serverless and the edge is. So typically you find that deploying on the edge, you experience like low latency, and Cloudflare Workers allows you to build your application either with JavaScript, TypeScript, C++, Rust, right? If there are Rust developers here. And yeah, it also has like great developer experience. And one other thing about building on the edge is, what about your data, right? This is a question that I personally ask myself, like, fine, it's good to deploy your application on the edge, but what if you have like a database as well, right? You find that there are different services allowing you to deploy your application on the edge. There are also services that would allow you to deploy your database on the edge, which is like mind-blowing, right? But also, it costs, of course, it costs money to do that. And at Cloudflare, we currently have several different options for you if you're thinking about deploying data on the edge. And developer services like Cloudflare Pages, which I'll talk about today, Stream, Cloudflare Stream, and a couple more others. Yeah. So I talked about Cloudflare Workers as the platform for deploying serverless code. And I think the reason why I love Cloudflare Workers is because of the access to everyone, right? So we have like 100,000 requests for free if you're thinking of like building your application to get started with. Typically, you find that this is good for like if you're looking at exploring serverless functions. This is good for like demo projects before you like build like full-on applications on the cloud. So it has low barrier for entry for people that are interested in trying it out. Now, Cloudflare workers, like I mentioned, you can write it in JavaScript or TypeScript. So if you prefer, you can also write in Rust, and it compiles to WebAssembly, right? This is a typical Hello Worker example of what a Cloudflare worker looks like. It's a JavaScript function that exports the fetch object, and this example here would return like an Hello Worker response to the browser. That's the syntax for how you work with Cloudflare workers. Moving away from Cloudflare workers, because this talk is mostly focused on Cloudflare pages. Now, Cloudflare pages is a different platform entirely. It allows you to deploy your full stack applications to the edge, right? I'd like to go back a little bit to talk briefly about how this came to be. So initially, Cloudflare Pages was a platform for you to deploy your static websites. So you have like a React website or a Vue website, you can deploy it to Cloudflare Pages. And the great thing about Cloudflare Pages is it offers you a couple of nice integrations like Git, for example. Now imagine you're working on a front-end project and you want to deploy that. With GitHub or Bitbucket connected to your Pages project, at every Git commit you make, there is a new preview link provided for you. So this is a very nice integration, I find, especially when you're working with a team of developers or designers. Okay. Yeah, it also gives you automatic CI/CD options. So if you're thinking of deploying a React or a Next website, for example, you can set up a build command, you can set up different preview links, preview options if you want your applications to create a preview links every time you make a commit. That's also possible. The automatic preview link I find is very useful, even for me as a developer. There is also opportunities to have several different environments. So if you're working on a full-on development team that has like staging and production, you can also set all of this up on Cloudflare Pages. And the good opportunity you have here is how easy it is to deploy or integrate your application with other Cloudflare products, for example, Cloudflare Access or Web Analytics. And with every project you create on Cloudflare, you also have free SSL certificates for your project. And then the big proponent of what I want to share is how you can move away from statically generated content to actually having dynamic content built with Cloudflare workers under the hood. And that brings me to the next thing I would like to share, Pages functions. So I mentioned that Cloudflare Pages allows you to deploy fully dynamic full stack applications to the edge. Now, the big thing here you need to know is this wasn't possible before, because one thing we found that people would do is if they need to deploy a application to the edge and they eventually need to add dynamic functionality, they would spin up a separate project, so a Cloudflare worker project, and then have this running side by side. Honestly, that's not a good developer experience, because then, for example, if you have an application that you need to add authentication to, instead of like having it just one application to deploy your website, you create a separate worker, you have to deploy that and then use it in your Pages application. So we made it easier for people to actually build all in one place. And introducing functions allows you to do that. So this is an example of a Noxt project. Are there Noxt developers here? Oh, nice, okay. I'm a Noxt fan, so that's why. This is a Noxt project that I created, and in order for me to add dynamic functionalities using serverless functions, you have to create a functions directory inside of your project. Now, once you do this, of course, you have to deploy it to Cloudflare Pages, like I mentioned, and once you do this, you can create JavaScript functions inside of this directory. In this example, I have an extra folder called API to try to mimic me actually having like an API for this front-end project. Now, remember I showed you the syntax of what a worker would look like. And the big thing here you need to know is Cloudflare workers is an abstract, Cloudflare functions is abstracted from Cloudflare workers. So you have the ability to build functions inside one single project instead of having to like manage two different projects at the same time. So you'd find that the syntax is quite similar with a few differences here. I showed you an Hello worker example, and this is same example but using pages functions. And the big difference here is some of the parameters, properties exported in the context parameter. For example, here you still have requests is the same thing in the workers API, environment is the same thing in the workers API, and the next object is new in this function, and that's because we allow you to also manage your middlewares in your pages functions, and you use the next parameter for that. Yeah. Another thing I would like to share about working on Cloudflare pages is a tool called Wrangler. So developers love CLI tools, right? You would think that we would like abstract some of these things to the browser, but I find that personally for myself, if there is a CLI and a browser, I would usually just choose the CLI because I just like working in the CLI. But anyway, Wrangler is the CLI for working with Cloudflare workers and also working with pages. So if you're building a pages project and you have it deployed to Cloudflare pages, you would use the Wrangler command to work both in development and also for publishing your project. So this is an example command of how to work locally with Wrangler, with Cloudflare pages. You would run the command Wrangler pages dev and then the directory that you're trying to deploy. So this could be, depending on the kind of projects that you're building. For Noxt, it's the dist directory. So running this command will build your application locally so you can test stuff before deploying it to Cloudflare pages. Now, why should you even use functions in the first place, right? So you have a front-end application that you're working on, and you find that you have a couple of things that you like to do. For example, maybe you want to add authentication to your application, or you want to connect to a third-party API. I think functions is a great use case for that situation. Here's a few examples of how you use pages functions. The first one is if you're looking to store data, dynamic data, or you're looking to connect to a third-party service or perform authentication, these are good example use cases for functions. Or geolocation-based redirect. I'll show you an example of how to do this, right? So imagine you have a front-end application and you want to serve different versions of that to different users, depending on where they are visiting the website from. Functions is a very good way to do that because it exports a cf.location object from the context that allows you to track wherever, whoever is visiting the website, you can get their actual location and serve them specific data or on the website. It's also very useful for caching data. So another thing I would share with you is Workers KV, which is a key value storage for saving data on the edge, right? And I find that another good use case is if you have an application you'd like to store temporary data or cache data on, functions and Workers KV are very good combinations to use when you're thinking about doing that. And of course, we also have Pages plugins, and this is an abstracted way of having multiple functions in your Pages environment. I shared with you the syntax for how to work with Pages functions, and I would like to talk about request handlers. So when you're typically writing an API, you typically have like a put request, a post request, a get request. Now, Pages functions have like an export async function on request handler, but if you're working like on an API and you have several different endpoints you like to hit, so for example, you have a get endpoint, a post endpoint, you can specifically set a specific request handler that ties back to the kind of request you're trying to make. So in this example, instead of using on request, which would typically still work, I'm using on request post, and you can also replace that with any of the other request handlers here on screen. Pages plugins is something else that is absolutely mind-blowing for me, specifically because I find that when I work, I like to improve. I would like to not have to do the same thing over and over again. So that's like developer productivity. And one thing that Pages plugins allows you to do is create libraries out of your functions. A quick example here is authentication. So if you have like different front-end applications that you keep writing the same auth handler for your application, you can actually abstract the function. So if you have like a auth.js file, you can actually abstract that as a Pages plugin and also deploy it or have it publicly available for other developers to use. I think I like that integration a lot because it allows me to, of course, be more productive and also allows me to have a way of contributing back to open source in a way. So I'll share why that is. Pages plugins, like I said, allows you to do different things. So you can create like a plugin that allows you to intercept HTML pages or inject third-party scripts like Google Manager or Google Analytics, for example. So you can have that abstracted as a plugin, or for validating authorization headers, like I mentioned, or even storing data in a database like KV or durable objects. So these are tasks that you typically have when you work on similar kinds of projects. So it's very good that you can actually abstract this into plugins. These are some examples of Pages plugins that we currently have on Cloudfare. We have a Google Chat plugin. So if you're thinking of integrating Google Chat into your front-end application, all you need to do is npm install the actual library, and you have Google Chat working. And these also, we have several other different plugins available. Now let's talk about data on the edge, right? We mentioned the edge is great for you to build your applications on, but what if you want stateful data on the edge? Like what if you want to have a database on the edge as well? We have several different options for you depending on your use case. So KV is one I would like to talk about today, which is a key value storage. And the good thing about KV is it has low latency. You can cache data on KV and have it have your front-end application retrieve data from KV. You have like unlimited reads to KV, which is great. And it's the caveat here is it's great for reading a lot of data from, like if you need to pull in data from KV, you get that in like less than a second because of course it's also duplicated across several different CDN locations. But yeah, if you're reading data frequently from it, it also has a caveat. So that's why, depends on your use case, you can also choose other data offerings. I would like to show you some examples of how I would typically use Pages functions in a front-end application. The first example here is geolocation redirects. So I mentioned that if you're working on a project and you would like to serve different websites or different content to your users, you would probably need to use Pages functions for this. So in this example right here, I created a function that shows a specific user. Oh yeah, I created a function that shows a specific website based on where I'm visiting the website from. So in my example here, I'm checking if I'm actually in Croatia, I should be served the Croatian Airlines website with the /HR translated page. So you can do an example of this using, like, say, for example, you have a website with several different languages and you want to serve that automatically without having them select the translation for the website. All you need to do is check where the user's request is coming from using the request.cf.country parameters. Another example that I found a lot of people do with Pages functions is API integration. So typically, if you have a front-end application and you want to fetch an API from a project, you can use from a different API, you can use Pages functions, and this is how you typically use it. In this example, this is a different function that I have, and I'm using the World Geodata API from Rapid API. So here I'm doing this similar thing with the geolocation. So I'm checking what country I'm visiting from. In this case, it's Croatia, and then fetching specific data about Croatia to add on my website. So right here, I'm running this application using Wrangler, like I mentioned, and based off of the request that I've sent, I would get like a response about Croatian data, the country Croatian data, and then I'm using that in my web application. And this is a very, I would say, simple use case, but I'm sharing this just so you know that this is possible for you to do in your application, and also like take it one step further if you're thinking of doing like translations or doing more complex applications, yeah? Another integration or another example of how to use pages functions in your application is using it to store data. Now, I mentioned workers KV, right? Workers KV is a key value storage. It allows you cache data on Cloudflare's edge network. In this example here, I have a redirect object. Now, what I want to do is store this object in KV, right? So that every time I fetch like a specific URL, it goes to KV because it's cached on KV. It goes to KV and fetches the URL and then redirects me to a specific website. So here I have a redirect object. I'm storing that in KV using the environment and the KV namespace to put the data on the KV storage. And this is what KV looks like. So if you use KV, or if you've used KV before, all you need to do is create a namespace, and then you have 3 commands. You have the put command for adding data, the get command for pulling data from KV, and the list command, and the delete command as well if you need to delete anything you've stored. So the redirect object that I had, I put it to KV, it's cached on the edge, and now what I do next is specifically say that for every the key, so for every URL that I fetch with the key, it should redirect to the actual URL that I've stored on KV. So this is an example demo of me trying to do that. So I hope this is clear enough, actually, because I'm seeing this. So here I'm using like the specific route that I called here, which is KV redirects / the key. So if I try to navigate to Workers or Cloudflare or Discord, it redirects automatically. Finally, middleware. One thing I find that people working with API is they always would need to add middlewares to the application. So it's also a useful use case if you're building API. So if, for example, you want to add like an error logging middleware to your application, you can do that in the _middleware file. And what this does is before it runs any of your functions, it actually triggers the middleware first. And yeah, I shared like high-level stuff about pages functions in this talk, but I'd like to ask you, if you can, check out the documentation to learn more about how you can actually use pages functions. It's still in beta right now, but it's going to be in general availability in like November, around that period. So people are currently using it right now in the application. I, for one, I use it in my web applications that I build. So if you'd like to check it out, definitely do that. Yeah, this is pretty much the end of the talk. If you'd like to check out pages functions, this is like a summary of what I showed you. It's easy to get started in your front-end applications. You can use it with React, Nox, Remix, Felt kits. And it works for several different use cases depending on what you want to do. Yeah, I'll just go through.
Well, thank you, Geeks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.